Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Marcia.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're covering the movie Red Tails, which came out in 2012. It was directed by Anthony Hemingway and written by John Ridley and Aaron Magruder. George Lucas is the producer behind the movie. He began pre-production for this in 1988 and couldn't get funding. So the movie ended up not being made until 2012.
He ended up actually funding the entire movie himself. He spent $58 million on production and $35 million on marketing. And he also directed a couple of the reshoots for this movie. And after this movie was released, his company was bought by the Walt Disney Company. So this was the last movie that Lucasfilms produced independently.
It's based on a book, Red Tails, Black Wings, The Men of America's Black Air Force by John B. Holway, which I did not read, but I did read Half American, The Epic Story of African Americans Fighting World War II at Home and Abroad by Matthew F. Delmont, to give a little bit of background to myself. What did you think of this movie?
I enjoyed it a little bit. Not a whole lot. I did enjoy watching it, but I didn't think it was very good. So, mixed feelings. It's an okay action movie. It's a little camp. I don't think I'll watch it again. Let's say it like that. How about you?
I just thought it was very forgettable, which is unfortunate because the story is really good, but they just didn't really do it justice. I found that the action scenes, to me, the way the movie opens, obviously we'll get into, but it opens on this fight scene in the air that's very Star Wars-y to me. I feel like you can tell that George Lucas made it. Just the music and the campy dialogue and the way the planes are depicted and just all of it. And the whole movie feels a bit cartoony and two-dimensional in that way, which we'll get into all of this a bit more. But yeah, I thought it could have been better.
Should we get right into the plot, or do you want to tell me what you thought of the book you read first?
Oh, yeah. I really liked it. I read it all in one day. It's 300 pages. And I think that and I'll just preface this by saying I know this is very white of me to underestimate the magnitude of a racism problem, but I really didn't realize how bad it was. Just being a Black person living in the United States in the 1940s. The book does a really, really good job. The writer's really strong at putting it together in a way where you're sort of following through the war chronologically, but you're also getting tons of information about what Black people were going through on the home front and overseas, and people who were in the military, their families who were not in the military, and describing specific incidents and sort of overarching policy things. And so I felt like it was a pretty comprehensive overview, and I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. But boy, some parts of it were a rough read.
That makes sense to me. I feel like we should mention very briefly, we didn't, that Red Tails is about the Tuskegee Airmen. And your book is not specifically about them, right? They're in it, probably.
They are in it, yes. But no, it's not specifically about them. It's more about the overall Black American experience during the war.
Oh, so you have a little bit of a wider understanding of it now.
Yeah.
Let's get into the movie.
Okay, so our opening card, we get a quote from a 1925 U.S. Army War College study that says, "Blacks are mentally inferior, by nature subservient, and cowards in the face of danger. They are therefore unfit for combat." So that's kind of how they open the movie, the framing of this movie. And yeah, this was a real study that came out and informed so much of what the US military did during World War II. Obviously, the military remained segregated for the entirety of the war. There were tons of American politicians willing to say the quiet part out loud. You know, if we let Black people in the military, how are we going to sustain white supremacy? People just coming out and saying that. So yeah, I felt it was a really good way to sort of put us in the atmosphere that these guys would have been in.
It makes you angry right away from the start of the movie. You're like, oh God, why?
Yeah, pretty gross. So we open on, it's interesting because we open on an air battle that the Tuskegee Airmen are not in. And it's sort of setting the stage for why the Tuskegee Airmen get recruited for certain missions later on. But basically, we're in an air battle. We see a group of bombers that are being attacked by German fighter planes. And the bomber crews are complaining to each other that they aren't getting adequate protection from the fighter planes. Like the fighter planes just keep fucking off to go and try and get kills rather than sticking with them to protect them.
Can I just say the dialogue in this is awful?
Oh my God, dude, it's so bad.
The black characters they have normal dialogue, but the white guys in this they're just
it's like straight out of a comic book. It's like Jiminy Cricket, Pete.
It makes no sense after the very serious opening like that. The opening card was so serious, and then this is just comical. I don't really get why they chose to do it this way.
Yeah, I almost thought that it was not going to end up being like a real scene. I thought that it was depicting like, oh, this is from like a movie at the time or something, and then we're going to pan out and people are going to be watching the movie. Like, I really didn't think it was an actual air battle. It was just so comically over the top and like, I don't know.
Like a Star Wars fight scene, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then we skip to Commerce Skies. It's Italy, it's 1944, and we're following a crew of the 332nd Fighter Group, which is the Tuskegee Airmen. And we meet our main characters of the film. So we have Captain Martin Easy Julian, played by Nate Parker. First Lieutenant Joe Lightning Little, played by David Oyelowo. Second Lieutenant Raygun Gannon, played by Tristan Wilds. Second Lieutenant Andrew Smokey Salem, played by Neo, of all people. And
Neo is in this?
Yeah, Neo is in this, yeah. And Second Lieutenant Samuel Joker George, played by Elijah Kelly. They take out a truck on the ground and then a train. Lightning undertakes a risky maneuver to do so, sort of setting himself up as the wild man against the advice of Easy. And the group complain to each other that they're flying these old shitty hand-me-down P-40 Warhawk planes and they're not getting any good missions.
I was really glad that the dialogue between these airmen was a little better than the white guys. So I was a little instantly relieved. I actually liked the shots too, like the onboard kind of shots. They look pretty good to me.
Yeah. Insofar as anyone in this movie is fleshed out, it's definitely the airmen. I feel like all the white characters are very just sort of two-dimensional racist cutouts. That's how they chose to set up the movie. But no, you're right. Like this, at least when these guys are talking to each other, you're like, well, that's a relief. At least the whole movie is not going to be like the first scene.
Yeah, it almost makes you wonder if it was done on purpose, because so often that happens to the black characters. So I wonder if it's almost like a purposeful choice to make them as insignificant as usually black characters would be.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally possible.
It might have been like this little winky, slightly on the nose thing about how usually the black people get the short end of the stick in movies like this, and now it's the white guys, like the tables have turned.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. We could give Lucasfilms a tiny bit of credit and assume that that's the case. We pick up with the airmen once they're already in Italy, but I thought it was worth talking a little bit about the airbase for which they are named, which was in Tuskegee, Alabama. And boy, so racism was bad everywhere in the United States in that era, but it was significantly worse in the South. Just because of how cheap land was in the South, a ton of military bases end up being built there. And so a lot of Black service people would enlist, and then they would be sent to bases in the South in these towns where they were not welcome. Well, that's the nice way to say it. And so the town was very racist towards them. Their CO was Colonel Frederick von Kimball. He was also very racist. He didn't believe in the capabilities of Black pilots at all. The segregated airbase, the conditions were so bad, it was described as a prison camp for Black servicemen and their families. There was a scenario where local police actually disarmed and beat a Black MP. And von Kimball's solution to that was to prevent Black MPs from carrying weapons, enforce a curfew on Black troops, and promise to, quote unquote, ferret out problematic personnel. So basically not holding the racist town responsible at all for their actions. And conditions were actually so bleak and demoralizing that William Hastie, who was a judge and the civilian aide to the Secretary of War, resigned his position with the War Department.
Wow. Yeah, what a dick. Sorry.
Yeah, he basically was like, listen, things are bad. Y'all are not listening to me. And people can't live in these kind of demoralizing positions and be expected to fight. So I'm out of here. So he just totally resigned over it. And there's actually a quote from the book that I read talking about the airmen. And they said they reckoned they would be safer in a war zone than staying in the Jim Crow South.
That's horrible. Imagine. I really can't even imagine. Must have been horrible.
There was a few incidents in the book that just there was this one group of engineering, it was like an engineering unit, and they were stationed outside of this town where a mob basically ran them out of town. And they all had to escape on different trains and then eventually meet back up. And their COs tried to court martial them, and they had to get like legal representation and all this stuff to be like, look, we couldn't stay there. The townspeople were literally attacking us and trying to kill us.
And they weren't even making trouble. They were just existing. It's making me so mad.
Yeah. There was a documentary that was made in conjunction with this movie about the Tuskegee Airmen. And I think they were talking about this, and it also got mentioned in my book, about how there were German prisoners of war who were brought to the United States, and they were actually treated better than Black servicemen. They had more privileges. They could go out into white towns and eat at the lunch counter or whatever. Like, it was just absolutely wild.
I also watched another movie called The Tuskegee Airmen from 1995, and it shows some of this as well. There's a bit more about actual Tuskegee in that movie, and it shows them also not being able to sit in the same train. What do you call them?
Train
Compartments?
cars?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They get to the south and they're made to exit the train, and then they have to get on another train because that one's only for white people.
So yeah, that's the unfortunate circumstance in which they found themselves. But yeah, just skipping back to they're in Italy and they're talking about how they're not getting any good missions. The airmen of the 99th Squadron had actually seen action already at this point. In the spring of 1943, they flew air support at Pantelleria, which is an island in the Mediterranean that would have allowed the Allies to control the sea lanes and facilitate the landing on Sicily. And then they also participated in the Sicilian landings themselves. And the movie seems to be conflating them with the 332nd Fighter Group, which came overseas after Anzio, which hasn't happened yet in the movie. And then the two groups kind of joined together, which is not a huge deal or anything like that. It just streamlines the narrative, I guess.
Yeah, the other movie does this in the right order. We get the 99 first. They join up later in the movie.
So Lightning, our wild man, he circles back to fly over the home of an Italian woman. We're later going to find out her name's Sophia, played by Daniela Rua, who waves at him from the roof, and it's love at first sight.
Yes, it is. I really enjoy her, but I know her from NCIS, so I just recognize her instantly. So that was fun for me. And she speaks Italian for most of the movie, too. She barely speaks English.
Mm-hmm. We also meet a new guy named Morris Wilson, played by Michael B. Jordan, who's invited to bunk with some of the airmen that we've already met, after it turns out that his intended bunkmates have already been killed. I sort of laughed when I watched this part because obviously Michael B. Jordan now has absolutely just exploded because of Black Panther, because of other stuff that he's done. And then seeing him in this movie where he has this bit part where you're like, oh, it's probably his role is going to be really significant. Like he's probably going to become like the baby of the group, whatever. It's like, no, he appears in a couple of scenes and that's it.
And then he dies.
Yeah.
A group of airmen gather when they return to base. We meet Major Emmanuel Stans, played by Cuba Gooding Jr., and he tells them that their leader, Colonel A.J. Bullard, played by Terrence Howard, is in the United States fighting for the survival of their unit after unflattering newspaper reports. And these actually happened, right? These newspaper reports were real.
Yeah, so there was the CO of the 33rd Fighter Group, of which 99th Squadron was a part, was Colonel William Momyer. And he was a huge racist, and nobody seemed to think this was a problem in putting him in charge of Black troops. But he wrote this super unflattering report about the airmen. He wrote, "It is my opinion that they are not of the fighting caliber of any squadron in the group. They have failed to display the aggressiveness and desire for combat that are necessary for a first-class fighting organization." And this is not the only thing he did. Like, he would plan a meeting for everybody, and then he would change the time and tell everybody except the 99th Squadron, so they would miss the meeting. And he would deliberately try and undercut them in all these little ways. And so he wrote this report, and then that report got leaked to the press. And the press being the press, the coverage was not very nice.
Now, you might know this because it's what you just described, changing the times and stuff, is in the other movie that I saw. They do that. And they also make them retake a test that they've already done. I don't know if you've read anything about this or whether that is actually true, but apparently he didn't believe that they were as good as the test made them out to be, so he thought they were cheating. And I'm sure, even if it's not specifically true, I'm sure that's the way he felt. Like this man was just evil.
Yeah, this guy sucked. But unfortunately, a lot of people sucked at that time. So yeah, and the character played by Terrence Howard, AJ Bullard, is based on Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who became the first Black general in the United States Air Force. At this time, the Air Force wasn't like a separate component yet. It was still part of the Army. And his father had been the first Black general in the U.S. Army, actually. And when Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was commissioned as a second lieutenant, the Army only had 2 Black officers who weren't chaplains, and it was him and his dad. And then him and his 4 classmates at Tuskegee became the first Black combat fighter pilots in the U.S. military. And then once he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, that's when he was named commander of the first all-Black air unit, which was the 99th Pursuit Squadron.
I also read that he went to West Point, but he was just completely ignored by everybody for being Black.
Yep. He was the first Black guy to graduate from West Point in like 40 years or something like that. He was the only one in his class, and he just had a terrible time. Like his classmates were just awful.
Yeah, you can't really tell on the podcast, guys, but I'm rolling my eyes so hard the entire time. It just infuriates me so much. And I'm white, so yeah. Imagine being Black and having to read all that. It must be so much worse.
Yeah, and the other frustrating thing too is that like a lot of people will try and excuse the behavior of historical figures by being like, oh, well, they're people of their time. But the thing is that there were white people who routinely stood up for Black servicemen and their families, and they did have allies within the government and within the military. And so there were people who were acting right. And so that just, to me, makes it even worse that there were so many people that just simply refused to see around their racism. Like the opportunity was there and they didn't do it.
Yeah, and this movie actually has a bunch of racists, but there's also another character played by Lee Ferguson, who plays kind of that role of the officer that kind of believes in this project. They call it the experiment, by the way, which is questionable by itself. I really enjoyed this scene between Bullard and Jack Thomason, the way he obviously believes in the project, and Bullard then almost cautions him against fighting for it because it's also putting his career on the line, even as a white man. And I guess that kind of shows you how deep the racism goes. Like, even if you are white, if you fight for these men's right to exist, basically, you might get your career destroyed.
Yeah, the stakes are very high because people are very racist.
Bullard is dealing with Commander William Mortimer, played by Bryan Cranston, and his racist skepticism about the airmen.
Yeah, another guy saying the quiet part out loud, racism-wise, and just being like, well, I don't know. Like, and then Bullard has to basically be like, well, you leaking this report makes your organization look bad. And so you'd better give us something actually to do so we can prove ourselves because y'all fucked up.
Exactly.
It's worth mentioning that besides the Tuskegee Airmen, slightly later in the war, there ended up being a couple of Black infantry units that saw combat as well as a tank unit. And there was a group of Black Marines at Iwo Jima, I believe. So there were small combat groups that ended up getting started, but again, they were still segregated and each of them really had to prove themselves. It was a huge uphill slog. You know, it was constantly them having to go above and beyond in order to prove that they deserve to be there.
So Easy and Lightning are kind of basically the best mates of this movie, I want to say. And they discuss Lightning's inability to follow orders, like he has a real problem with authority, even if it's from Easy. And Lightning then leaves to go to Sophia's house, which I thought was funny, because how did he remember exactly where she lived from just that one time of seeing her? But he goes there and her mother's there and mother goes on a date with him. Which made me giggle. Her mother is like super excited about there being an American in their lives, even if he's Black.
Yeah, They only speak Italian and he only speaks English. And I thought this was a sort of interesting plot line to include because when a lot of Black Americans went overseas, they were surprised to discover that other white people were not as racist as Americans, which is not to say that the countries of Europe didn't have a racism problem, because that would not be true. But literally the treatment of Black American servicemen by white American servicemen was so bad that even British civilians were like, well, that's a bit much. Like the British literally were like, can you believe how racist the Americans are? And this is from, 1940s Britain. So it's not like they were, just beacons of progressivism.
Yeah, it's wild.
I just thought it was cool that it was like, yeah, they're showing him like having an interaction with, a white person that's not steeped in racism the way it would have been in the United States.
No, and like even if they were, you wouldn't even know about it because they barely understand each other.
Well, but you would be able to tell from the way they treat him.
Yeah, I guess they wouldn't be sitting on the couch with all three of them on a two-person couch like that.
I don't even think the mom would have let him in the house. The airmen are assigned to support the Allied landings at Anzio as part of Operation Shingle, and they acquit themselves super well in their first face-off against German fighter planes. This is not in the movie. Under pressure from Black public figures and after a summer of high racial tensions over racism at home in the war industry, the War Department actually agreed to commission a study of the 99's performance prior to their involvement at Anzio, to just be like, all right, once and for all, like, let's get the data and either shut the racists up or whatever. And so the airmen did super well. They shot down a dozen Nazi planes. This allowed Allied forces on the ground to get within striking distance of Rome the way they wanted. And so they got some glowing press coverage in the white media, which was a dramatic about face from all the abuse they had taken before.
Yeah. I mean, it makes for a nice change, but a very slow one, I would say.
It's worth mentioning as well that at the same time as there was all this terrible coverage in the white mainstream media, there were a ton of Black newspapers in the United States, and all of them were routinely covering this stuff. And obviously, the coverage of the Tuskegee Airmen was a lot more fair than it was in the white media. So there was this whole sort of other side to the media as well.
So Reagan, who's also called, at this point, they're still calling him Junior, and he doesn't really like it. But he's wounded on a mission and his eyes are affected, and he gets down to the ground. But then he's in the hospital for a bit, I think, or in a medical tent or something. But he really wants to fly again, so Easy kind of takes pity on him and lets him back on the roster.
Yeah.
I like this character, by the way.
Bullard meets with General Lentz, played by Gerald McRaney, and gets assigned a new mission escorting bombers this time. They reference what we learned at the beginning of the film, where the current fighter pilots are not really protecting the bombers because they're too busy sort of leaving them to try and go and rack up kills. And Bullard successfully argues for them to get new planes because they've been flying these shitty hand-me-downs. So they get some P-51 Mustangs, which they're pretty well known for. And they paint them in the new style that's sort of distinctive to the unit now, which is where they get their name, Red Tails.
They look awesome.
Yeah, there are some parts of this movie that look good.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even that old, but if you look at the battle scenes in the air, they kind of look a little bit shitty for 2012. If I compare it to the 1995 one, that looks as good as this one. I don't know, probably a budget thing or something.
Yeah, I almost wonder too, I feel like in older movies, they really had to rely a lot on the magic of special effects. It was figuring out different ways to do stuff. It was like, all right, do we do models? Do we do this? Do we do that? And then in recent years, it's becoming really heavily dependent on CGI. And sometimes it just doesn't look very good.
No, I agree.
So we get a brush with racism in the next scene. Lightning ends up getting arrested. He goes into a whites-only officers club, and they are not happy to see him. And he gets into a scrap, and he ends up getting a dressing down from Bullard about his behavior.
Yeah, we should talk about the documentary a little bit here, because in the documentary, they talk about, I think, 3 officers, Black officers, that go into a white officers club and they get arrested for it. And one of them actually gets court-martialed, and until, I want to say, sometime in the 90s, he had all his rights taken away. Like, he couldn't vote and he couldn't do all the stuff that convicted criminals basically didn't get to do.
If you get a court-martial, it's the same as getting a felony. So you lose basically all of those rights.
Yeah, his record was quite clean, but not until the 90s. So it's a long time to be seen as a felon.
Yeah, it was a good scene to include in this movie because there was quite a few times where the Tuskegee Airmen tried to forcibly integrate. And I don't mean that in like a way of violence, just by saying, oh, like they knew that they weren't allowed in these places, but then they would go into anyway. So there was quite a lot of that, which is very brave in its own way.
And it was against the Army's regulations as well to segregate the officers' club because it says that it's for all officers in the regulations.
But then they would do stuff like one of their COs was like, okay, well, actually, the officers club is only for people who are instructors. And then he made all of the white officers into instructors.
Yeah. How low can you go, really, to just make shit up just to punish these men who did nothing wrong?
Yeah, it was pretty gross. So they head off on their new mission after being instructed in their sort of key purpose, which is going to be protecting the bombers at all costs, which we know is going to be tough for Lightning because he likes a little flash, a little dazzle. He likes to be the center of attention. And they are sort of gathered in a group shouting out this, I don't know, motto. And they say, nothing's difficult. Everything's a challenge. Through adversity to the stars. From the last plane to the last bullet to the last minute to the last man. We fight. We fight.
Yeah, it made me laugh a little bit, to be honest. It made me think of Toy Story for no reason.
Why Toy Story?
Because it kind of reminded me of To Infinity and Beyond.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be like a rousing speech, but like everything in this movie, I think it just maybe doesn't quite land.
I feel like with a different tone it might have. Another thing this movie does is that the music is kind of a little bit campy too. It's like action movie camp.
Yeah.
So it doesn't help.
Now, predictably, when they get into the sky, the American bomber crews are immediately racist about the airmen being their escort. They look out the window and they see that the fighter pilots escorting them are all black, and they say something. One of them says something to the other like, well, I guess we can't depend on any air support this time, boys.
I know. It's so unserious. It's just...
Yeah, just incredibly on the nose. Like, of course it's racist, but it's very, like, I don't know. It's just, it comes off a bit silly almost.
Yeah, and in this airfight, guys, there's one German fighter that we see. They call him Pretty Boy. He's played by Lars von Riesen, and he's like this very typical German-looking dude.
Yeah, he turned up in the fight scene at the beginning of the movie, and he was the only German guy whose face we saw looking nefarious. And then we see him again in this one, and we're like, he's back, our favorite German.
Yeah, and he says equally like cliche stuff as well.
He does. He's yelling racist stuff, but in German.
So, unfortunately, Reagan, or Junior, is still bailed out of his plane because he can't really see the enemy because he's wounded. So, he does make it to the ground, but he's then arrested by the Germans.
Want. The bombers are happy because they didn't lose any planes in this bombing run over Ploesti. And then they say another line like, we're almost home. I hope we meet up with those red tails next time.
I know. It's the worst. Like, they could be more subtle. The other movie is more subtle. And the fact that they immediately call them red tails too is kind of like, would they really? Would they just not call them by their unit name instead of the red tails at this point?
Yeah. Lightning and Smokey peel off from the escort, which they're not supposed to do, but they figure, hey, we're on our way home. So they actually take out a German destroyer off the coast of Italy. And this is actually based on a real event where 2 Tuskegee pilots and Thunderbolts did have an encounter, but it was with a German torpedo boat, not a destroyer. And a torpedo boat is a lot smaller. So it's a lot more likely that they would have been able to take it out by strafing it from the air. And yeah, so they took it out. This was in June 1944, and the ship was actually so badly damaged that it later had to be scrapped.
Smokey is played by Neo, by the way, in case you forgot. It's just...
We have to remind you that Neo is in this movie.
I don't know how to feel about him in this movie. He's kind of southern, I think. I don't know what he's trying to do with his accent. It's just kind of strange.
I'm not like a Neo expert. I don't know what he sounds like in real life, but I have to assume he's not talking with the accent or speech affectation that he does in this movie.
Yeah. It's something.
And none of these characters are based on real people except the Terrence Howard character. And so it's not like he was really doing his homework on a real guy and was like, all right, I'm going to try out this accent. He just was like, nah, I'm just going to do an accent.
And he does a little song in this as well. There's a little guitar song.
You're right.
I don't remember when it is in the movie. It doesn't contribute to the plot. I'm sure they were like, oh, we've got a musician here. We'll do a little ditty.
Second Lieutenant David the Deacon Watkins, played by Marcus T. Polk, is badly wounded, and Easy tries to escort him to safety. And he's having a real bad time. He's passing out from the blood loss and all this stuff. He's supposed to bail because his plane is fucked, but he can't get the canopy open, and he crashes the plane and is narrowly carried to safety before it explodes, and he ends up getting medically discharged.
Yeah, that will make me really nervous. I thought he was gonna die.
I also thought he was gonna die. And the part where he couldn't get the canopy open, like all that kind of stuff was really common in these planes. Like they were just in the bombers as well. It was like pretty common to have these like technical difficulties that ended up being life and death for a lot of guys, which is super unfortunate.
So as this happens, they return to base. Lightning and Easy have a fight because Easy is a drinker, and Lightning blames Easy for what happened to Dee. So friends get kind of in a fight for a bit.
Yeah, we've been seeing throughout the movie that Easy has a bit of a drinking problem, and we're going to find out that he blames himself for what happened to Ray Gun too. So this is kind of the main, I guess, like emotional conflict of the movie. Ray, who obviously he's crashed and he was captured by the Germans, so he gets taken to Stalag 18, which is a German POW camp. And there he gets recruited into an escape ring because they know he can't be a German spy because he's black.
They're also very racist again in the beginning.
Yep. Lightning and Easy make an agreement that Easy will stay sober if Lightning stops flying like an asshole, which was going to be tough for both of them.
Yeah, you actually see Easy drinking later again too. Like he doesn't really keep up his end of the bargain there.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, Lightning, I mean, spoilers, but Lightning is not really going to end up holding up his end of the bargain either.
They go into town and they think they're about to have a racist encounter, but guess what? He's from the bomber group they protected, and then they all go for a drink and are best mates.
Yeah, they're literally just like walking down this Italian street, and some white guy is like, hey, aren't you guys the airmen? Like he's just yelling after them in this tone of voice, and you're like, oh, here we go. Like they're gonna get into it now. And then the guy's like, you know, I used to be racist, but you guys say yes, and now I'm not, so I'll buy you a drink.
And then after that, Lightning actually asked his girlfriend Sophia to marry him. She asked for some time to think. She eventually says yes, but only if he stays in Italy. And he wants to. He wants to stay in Italy, I think.
Yeah. And we switch back to Ray in his POW camp, and he's part of an escape with a group of other prisoners, wherein he saves Captain Miller. Captain Miller was the one who had recruited him to the escape ring in the first place. He's played by Paul Fox. So he saves Captain Miller from capture by sort of drawing the Germans away. And Captain Miller just assumes that Ray Gun didn't make it because this was a very risky thing to have done.
Yeah, and Ray has given him his dog tags to return to the Tuskegee in case he doesn't make it.
And then we flip back to the rest of the group. They're talking about these new jets, which are the 262s that the bomber group told them about. And they're discussing it with their long-suffering mechanic, First Sergeant Coffee Coleman, played by Andre Royo. And he's basically spends the whole movie just giving them shit for fucking their planes up, particularly Lightning.
Yeah, I mean, can you really blame him?
Yeah, they're giving him lots of work to do. The Messerschmitt 262 was a jet-powered fighter, first of its kind. And the first flight in combat of a jet airplane was on July 25th of 1944. There were 1,400 that the Germans built, but less than 300 of them saw combat. And there's a few reasons for this. There had been substantial destruction of German infrastructure, so it was hard to move parts around. It was hard to move finished planes around. It was hard to any of the pieces that they needed to like put together these planes, they were having a hard time accessing as well. And also at that point in the war, they were running low on pilots. And so, yeah, well, unfortunate for the Germans, but probably fortunate for everyone else. But the jets, of course, were much faster than the traditional propeller planes, which the Tuskegee Airmen realized. But though they're a lot faster, they don't corner as well. And so the Tuskegee Airmen still had an advantage in certain ways against them.
Right. So they could make quicker turns and get underneath them and turn around faster and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the traditional propeller planes also accelerated faster. So their top speed was slower than the jets, but they could accelerate faster.
Right. Interesting. I love planes.
Bullard and Stantz meet with Luntz and find out that they'll be escorting the bombers. They're making the first run over Berlin, and they seem to think it's going to be this big propaganda coup. They're like, yeah, we're going to bomb Berlin. But they're only going to allow the Tuskegee Airmen to be along on the first leg of the trip because they're like, well, if we let them go the whole way, then it'll be in the papers, and we don't want that. The first bombings over Berlin were actually in late August, early September of 1943, and we know now that it's 1945, so it can't be the first bombing run over Berlin. But it was one of the first runs all the way to Berlin and back for an Italian-based fighter unit. So there is that.
So it's almost accurate. It's not quite.
Well, it's fine.
So Captain Miller returns Ray's dog text to Easy because he thinks obviously that Ray did not survive the escape. Easy then tries to get himself demoted because he's the one who let Ray fly, but Bullard doesn't let him do that. He's like, no, you don't.
Yeah, the group needs their leader, I guess. So they go on run escorting the bombers, and they're only supposed to fly the first leg, as we said, but the relief fighters never show up because of inclement weather. And so the Red Tails stick with the bombers all the way to Berlin. And there's this long-standing myth about the airmen that they never lost a bomber, which is pretty cool. But we now know that's not quite true. But the record was still pretty good. It was typically better than the other fighter escort units.
From what I could find, I think they lost 27 bombers overall their mission, which apparently is not very many.
No, Pretty Boy is back, and he's got a motherfucking jet this time.
Oh, no!
And yeah. And the airmen put up a good fight. There's a callback to earlier in the movie where Lightning took on the train by attacking it from the front. And so he does that again to face down Pretty Boy in the same way. And so he faces him down from the front and successfully destroys Pretty Boy's plane. But unfortunately, he is fatally wounded in the process. And Easy tries to save him like he did with Deke by sort of guiding his plane down. But unfortunately, Lightning's plane crashes and he doesn't make it.
I know. This for me was probably the saddest part of the movie. Not so much him dying, but the other guys from the squadron kind of asking Easy what's going on. I thought was pretty emotional.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just wild to imagine someone who's your close friend dying that way. And there's not a body. You're not going to be able to bury him probably. And yeah, just really sad.
Yeah, and you're right there with him, but then again, you're not, because he's in a different plane and he's going to crash. Impossible to think about it, and I really can't really imagine what it's like.
Easy pours out his whiskey, sort of symbolically maintaining his sobriety in the wake of Lightning's death. And then he goes to tell Sophia that Lightning has died.
Yeah, I'm really glad that no one else from the squadron married her. I feel like this movie would have been able to do that. That's the kind of movie it is, but I'm glad they didn't do it.
Yeah, although the ending kind of cracks me up. So they're all gathered to sort of have a memorial to Lightning, and Bullard is doing this, heartfelt speech and whatnot. And then Ray turns up like out of nowhere, and we find out he's survived the escape, and he just like busts in just like, hey guys, I made it. It's just like a weird, like sort of emotional flip. I don't know.
Yeah, and they finally then call him Raygun, right? Because they didn't before, they just called him Junior.
Yeah, this was the part of the movie where I realized that. So early in the movie, he pulls out this like toy gun, and that's why he wants to be called Raygun, because he has this little ray gun, I guess. And it's almost like Chekhov's ray gun, because you're like, surely that ray gun's going to factor again later in the movie, and then it just doesn't. And you're like, oh, okay.
I kind of forgot where Michael B. Jordan's character dies because no one pays any attention to that whatsoever. It's so weird.
Here's the thing too. So early in the movie, none of the guys are wearing their like face masks in the planes, but they keep grabbing them to talk into them. So it really draws attention to the fact that they're not wearing them. And I looked this up, and I guess the missions that you would fly in a P-40 would be low altitude enough that you don't actually have to wear a mask. And it just conveniently works out that by the later point in the movie where they're flying higher altitude missions where you'd have to wear a mask, we already know who they are. So we can sort of like recognize them from, the part of their faces that we can see. But I still find it difficult. Like some of them, you're right. Like I don't remember when Michael B. Jordan's character.
I feel like they don't even really acknowledge it because it might be when either when Ray is shut down or when Deke is injured, so it's either one of those two. And the other ones are like in the friend group and he's just on the fringe of it, basically. So just not deemed as important, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess that's what happens in a war. Lots of people die, and you can't necessarily spend a ton of time mourning each and every one of them. But I did think it was interesting that they went out of their way to introduce him, and then he sort of disappears.
Yep.
So we end with the Distinguished Unit Citation being conferred upon the 332nd. And the end card says that the unit earned 96 distinguished flying crosses during the war, and the 66 airmen were killed in action. So I did look this up just to get like the actual numbers, because we know from Band of Brothers on forward that we can't trust the title cards in a movie. And I guess during the war, Tuskegee trained around 990 pilots, but only 350 of them went overseas. And when the war in Europe ended, the Tuskegee Airmen had shot down 112 enemy aircraft, destroyed 150 aircraft on the ground, and knocked out more than 600 railroad cars and 40 boats and barges. Not a bad little tally. And approximately 150 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in combat or in accidents, and 32 became prisoners of war.
So that's a lot more than those 66 then.
Yeah, I wonder if the 66 is maybe just like the 99th Squadron, or maybe of the 150 that were killed, maybe a huge chunk of them were in accidents, because that was common.
You know what's funny to me? Like, I thought the documentary that was also made at the same time as this movie was really good. And I'm just kind of surprised at how not so good the movie was in comparison.
Yeah. It's funny because it really seems to have been a labor of love for George Lucas. I mean, as we said at the beginning, he started trying to make this movie in 1988, and it took him a long time to get it off the ground, ostensibly because Hollywood didn't believe in the money-making power of an all-black cast. But considering how much time went into it, really the product of it was not that remarkable.
But I'm still glad that there are movies about the Tuskegee Airmen out there.
Yeah, the movie definitely deserves to have been made. Unfortunately, I wish it were better, you know?
Yes, agree. I wrote down lol the cow jokes, and I don't even remember the cow jokes. Apparently there were cow jokes in the beginning.
Yeah, it was when they're flying over Italy there, and they're like talking about how they're not getting any good missions, or making jokes about like cows or something. I don't know.
Apparently it made me laugh, and then I forgot about it. But there was a funny little thing when I think they're in Italy on the base, and you hear the radio playing, and it's Access Mary. And Access Mary was not an actual thing, but Access Sally was the generic nickname given to women radio personalities who broadcast English language propaganda on behalf of the Axis powers during World War II. And there were a couple of them, but the one that broadcasted in Italy would have been Rita Zucca, who was Italian America. She broadcasted for fascist Italy. I thought it was nice that they included that little bit of reality into this movie again.
Yeah, they would play their radio station because in between these propaganda messages would be like actual music. And so the guys would, they'd listen to the music, and then in between there'd be messages like, oh, your wife's probably at home cheating on you. Oh, you should probably just surrender now. And there was actually specific propaganda messages that were directed to Black troops, being like, your country doesn't respect you. They'll never respect you. Why are you laying down your life for this country? Yeah.
It's kind of a little bit reminiscent of the Japanese radio shows that were like, your government is lying to you and they don't care about you. Stuff like that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. You have in your notes here that Mildred Gillers was a German-American woman who broadcasted for Nazi Germany, making these propaganda messages. And the United States convicted her of treason, and she was sentenced to 10 to 30 years imprisonment, which to me is wild because at the Nuremberg trials, real-life Nazis who actually killed people would get like 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, maybe 10. Like there was tons of Nazis that didn't serve significant time. And then this woman who recorded propaganda messages, they're like, well, throw the book at her.
Yeah, and it says even on the Wikipedia page about this, it says that most of these airmen and other army people, they didn't really believe it anyway. So why would you get like 30 years in prison for this?
Yeah. Well, Cuba Gooding Jr. was also in your Tuskegee Airmen movie. Did we mention that? He was in both of them.
We did not. No, I don't think.
In like every scene in this movie, that man is chomping the hell out of a pipe. Before, we've discussed how in Band of Brothers in the Pacific and some other war media, they have a boot camp for the actors. And apparently they also did that in this movie.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
C. Alfred Chief Tennyson, who was a real Tuskegee Airman, he was the one who, there's this famous flight where Eleanor Roosevelt went down to the airbase and she was like, well, I heard like people have told me that like Black people can't fly. And like, can I go up on a flight with you? And the Secret Service did not want her to do this. But Anderson was like, yeah, hell yeah. So he took her up on this flight and he came down and she was like, well, you can fly. All right. Eleanor Roosevelt was actually, I believe, on the committee for the NAACP. She ended up being a real supporter of these guys and helped to get them funding and that sort of stuff. And Anderson actually became the first Black American pilot to receive a commercial pilot certificate and to make a transcontinental flight. So that's pretty cool.
That's cool.
And with regard to the actual airmen, there were fewer of them in the unit. And so they flew more missions on more consecutive days than any of the white units. But they knew that even though they were exhausted and they had the same kind of battle stress that everyone else was facing, they had no margin for fucking up. There's this quote by Lemuel Curtis, who is one of the Tuskegee Airmen, and he said, if we had failed, the whole history of Air Force integration would have changed, but we didn't go in it to fail.
Wow, that's very strong. I think in the documentary, they also say that Davis frequently asked them to stay. They never said no to him. So must have been like they didn't rotate out. I don't think at all, because there just weren't enough pilots.
Yeah, they really had to go out of their way to go above and beyond. And in order to be viewed as successful, they had to be seen as, you know, better than the white units. They just didn't really have any other choice because, like you said, they were like government officials were calling this an experiment. There were a lot of people who genuinely did not believe that Black people could be pilots.
Just shaking my head. You can't see.
Yeah. The American Armed Forces were not integrated until 1948. They weren't really fully desegregated until the end of Korea, but that's kind of when it all started in 1948. And basically what had happened was when the war was over, all these Black veterans came home, and seeing Black people in uniforms really enraged racists on a level previously unforeseen. And so a lot of Black veterans were getting mobbed, lynched, mutilated, murdered. It was absolutely wild the way they were being treated. And so a group of Black activists went to President Truman and they were like, look, the government has to do something. Like, these veterans served their country and then they came home and they're being, you know, killed out here. And so they presented him all these different situations where this had happened. And he was absolutely, his mind was blown. He had no idea that this was going on. So he formed a committee to basically figure out, how do we deal with this whole racism thing? And the committee made a whole stack of recommendations that were never going to pass in Congress or anything because everyone sucked and there was no political will to do it. So Truman did the only thing that he could do independently himself because he was commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And so he desegregated the military. And this was sort of the forerunner of, you know, the military became desegregated, and that was the beginning of more things becoming desegregated. So, you know, Brown v. the Board of Education in the early 60s, when schools became desegregated, like it was sort of got the ball rolling in terms of integration.
Thank God for these men that went to war, I guess. If they'd never gone, then they probably wouldn't have been as much progress.
Well, honestly, that was a big part. A lot of the stories in the Black media at the time were like, look, if we don't get Black men into combat after the war, we're going to get razzed for not having participated in combat. They knew in order for us after the war to access veterans benefits, the GI Bill, in order for us to be considered as full citizens of this country, like, we know that we have to have Black people in combat. So that was sort of a big part of it. And Black newspapers and public figures actually ran what they called the Double V campaign during the war. So the double Vs were victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. It became this whole thing where after previous wars where Black people had fought, there was 300,000 Black men fought in World War I believe, on the American side. and they had participated in the Spanish-American War and then some other conflicts. And each time they had come back and they had just not been treated any better. So there was a lot of public figures, your Thurgood Marshalls and that sort of thing, just basically being like, all right, how do we make it so that this time laying down our lives for our country actually gets us something?
Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot and also talking to you about it. I'm so impressed with the Tuskegee Airmen because they are so proud to have fought for their country. And I don't know, like, a country that spits on you, basically, and they're still proud. That I thought that was just really, like, moving and impressive, be able to still feel that and still be... I almost wonder if they were fighting more for their right to fight than for the actual cause.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a super interesting thing to think about. I feel that, especially with so many Black servicemen being posted at bases in the South and the way they were treated by not just their COs, but people in the surrounding towns and the white media and all this stuff, they were almost fighting a war on two fronts. You know, they were fighting the fascists, but they were also almost refighting the Civil War at home.
Yes, it's horrible. And the documentary is actually called Double Victory as well. So it also refers to this a lot. Like, the documentary, I want to say, is almost more about the fight against racism than about the actual war.
Yes, and you can watch the documentary on YouTube if you want to. And we definitely recommend the documentary as well as the 1995 TV movie over Red Tails.
Yes, agree. We do still have to rate this movie.
We do. So let's rate it Cuba Gooding Jr. sucking on a pipe out of 10.
He does it so often, guys. It's like in every single scene, he's chomping on that stupid pipe.
And this man is chewing the scenery when he does it. He's just chomping on that thing.
I'll go first because I have a rather shocking rating, I think. Because I'm only going to give it a 6. Cuba Gooding Jr. sucking on a pipe out of 10. Only 6.
Wow. Only 6? Cuba Gooding Jr. sucking on a pipe?
I mean, I think I gave Bill Harbor a 5. So me giving this a 6 is not a good rating. Oh, I'm giving it a 6 because of the subject matter. Basically. That's it. That's all I have to say about it.
Yeah, you know, it's unfortunate because I went into this movie with high hopes. I really enjoyed the book that I read. I was excited to sort of see a different perspective of the war. We're always talking about that. And then the movie was just not good. So I'm going to give it a 5. And most of those 5 points are for the subject matter as well.
Yeah. So I would indeed recommend the 1995 movie. If you want to watch one of those, I would pick that one.
All right. So what are you reading?
I'm still reading my same book, so I'm not going to mention it again because I'm embarrassed.
Well, you don't have to be embarrassed. You've been like making a website and stuff for us, and I gather doing a bunch of artwork, so you're busy.
I am busy, but so are you, and you still read.
Oh my goodness. Actually, I was talking to someone last night about the fact that I've read probably more books this year than I've read in most years in recent memory. And my friend was like, is it easier to finish books when you know that you're going to be asked what you're reading on your podcast every week? And I was like, that does make it easier to finish books.
It's a sense of pride, guys.
Yeah.
So next week we have our second part of our myth-making episode for you guys. I hope you enjoyed the first one.
Yes. And I am currently reading The Real Great Escape by Guy Walters because we will be covering the movie The Great Escape pretty soon.
Is that all? I think that's all, right?
Thanks again for listening. You can follow us wherever you get your podcast and rate us 5 stars. That would be super helpful. You can also follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. You can visit our website. Remind me what it is again?
RosieTheReviewer.com.
See, super easy, and I couldn't even remember it. So yeah, see you next week.
Bye.